Hello and welcome back. In this tutorial we are going to explore the concept of static. So we're going to begin by copying the candy bar example that we just did. We're going to right click on this project and say copy. We're going to call it CSE 1302_01_02 because this is the second video in the first unit. And if we click copy, it's going to copy the entire project right here, and both the candybar.java and the main Java will be brought in. So we'll just double click both of those and have them there. And if we right click on the project itself, we can set this as the main project, and then we can close the old project that we had. Okay, so now we've got our CSE 1302_01_02 project with candybar.java and main.java. And be careful that you only have these open, because you could have multiple projects open and then the source might be pointing to a different project than the one that you think that you're editing. Okay, we're actually going to leave the main.java alone, and if you recall, we just instantiated objects of the candybar class and printed out some information, and we also demonstrated that we have our equals command so we could do comparison between different candy bars. Okay, just to show that everything is well, if we run this, we get the output that we expected, just like we had in the last video. Now let's go into the candybar.java code, and I want to modify this to include different different properties. And what's going to be different about this is that we're going to have static as a keyword in front of these properties. You'll notice that the name, the calories, the weight, and the cost, and all of these methods that are acting on those properties are instance or object level attributes. So that we call these instance variables, and we've got instance-based methods that act on those. But we have the ability to share data and share methods between occurrences of the class, or between different instances of the class. And we can do that by marking them as static. So if you look at your candy bar, if you look at a standard candy bar, you'll notice that oftentimes they have, or most food products, they have a unique identifier on them. They have some unique ID that shows perhaps the manufacturing plant and the date on which they were born or manufactured. And they might have an expiration date as well. So let's set up our candy bar class such that every object has a unique ID. And in order to do this, we're going to need to share a ID count among all objects of the candy bar class. So we want to place this ID at the class level, not at the object level. So I'm going to create a private int ID, but I'm going to mark it as static. Okay, and notice that this is a keyword within Java, so we have the keyword static here. And what that does is that now the ID, this uppercase I, uppercase D, is going to be shared among all objects. They're going to have the same value no matter which object I am, as long as the object is of type candy bar. Okay? In addition to the static or shared ID, I want to add a instance variable. I'm going to call this unique ID. And this is actually going to be a string. And the reason for that is that I'm going to take the current date that this thing was born on and then append to that this unique ID. And we're going to start this ID off at 0, and we're just going to increase it. Every time I create a candy bar, we're going to make it go up by 1. Okay? Now I have 3 constructors here, one that takes no parameters, one that takes 4 parameters, and one that takes 1. And so I need to update these such that I'm setting the unique ID. Now I could put the code right here inside the constructor, but then I'd have to repeat that code 3 different times. So better is I'm going to create a method called setUniqueID, and the constructors are going to call this function. Notice it's complaining because it doesn't know what that is, so let's create it right now. We can make this private because no one outside of the candy bar class needs to see it. And there we are. Now if I can spell it right, set unique ID, and I just need to fill in the data. Okay, so I'm going to say something like unique ID is equal to, And remember I said I wanted to use the current date and time to show when it was born, essentially. So let's use the date type. I'm going to call this this object called now, and it's going to be equal to a new date. Now it's complaining that it doesn't know what date is, so let's right click on that and fix the imports. And we have some choices here now, right? In fact, we do want to use java.util.date and import that. And if we go up to the top of our class, now it's added that import java.util.date, and now the date is recognized. So the unique ID that I'm going to assign, and remember the unique ID is a instance variable, so we could take it and move it here because it is one of these instance variables. The unique ID is going to be a concatenation of the time, so we'll say now.getTime, and that's going to return to me a very long integer that represents the number of milliseconds since January 1st of 1970. That's a bit of computer nerd talk, but that's the beginning of time, if you will, with respect to computers. And I want to append to that an underscore and then the ID. Now remember, this all caps ID is actually the static variable that we defined here. And so no matter how many times I call candy bar, at this point that ID is always going to be 0. And I don't want to leave it at 0, so let's update the ID by creating a new method called updateID. So let's define that. And you'll notice that I'm doing something here in updateID that's a little bit different. I'm actually going to mark it as private static void, and you'll notice that now I'm defining a static method. This is a little bit different because heretofore all of my methods, whether they were constructors or getters or setters, were just marked as either private or public. In fact, this one is marked private static, and this means that I can only do things to the static attributes or the static properties. I can't do anything to instance variables because this method, updateID, is going to be shared among all occurrences. There's only going to be one version of this method, whereas these other methods here are actually running within the scope of the object. This method is running within the scope of the class, so it can only access class level properties, or in this case the only thing that we have that's class level is this all caps ID because it's static too. So the rule is, if it's an instance method, I can access the instance variables. If it is a class method or static method, then it can only access the static variables. So I'm going to increment my ID by 1. So every time I create a new object, it's going to run one of these constructors, and it's going to set the unique ID. Set unique ID is going to grab the value of the ID and store that in the unique ID, and then it's going to invoke this update ID, which is going to increase the all caps static ID there. And that means that every time I create a new object, this ID is going to go up by 1. And then the next object that comes along is going to have a different ID at the end there. Okay? And just for kicks, let's put a message to the user to say that another candy bar has been created. This candy bar, or this is candy bar number, and we'll say ID to have been created. Okay, so ID is going to keep going up, and so every time we instantiate a candy bar and we create a new object of the candy bar, what we should see is this ID going up, and we should get this output. Okay, let's leave that alone then. And at this point, if we just run it, let's see what we get. The output's a little bit longer here. So we have another candy bar has been created. This is candy bar number 1 to have been created. And then here's our output from the main. Then I create another candy bar, and that's number 2. And we do a bit of output inside of main. And then we have another candy bar that was created, and this is candy bar number 3. If we go back into main and count the number of new candy bars that I create, here's one here, right? Here's the next one, And then finally, here is the third candy bar to be created. And if you really know what's going on in memory, the astute observer of this video will notice that we have my candy bar, we have your candy bar, we have his candy bar, and we have her candy bar. So you might say, well, we have 4 candy bars, but how come only 3 of them were created? Notice I've got candy bar 1, 2, and 3 that were created. And if you look real carefully, this line right here, the his candy bar, I'm not actually creating a new candy bar, I'm just having his candy bar point to the your candy bar. So in memory I've only got 3 that I've created, and that's exactly why we have the 3 outputs that we have here. Okay, so the static attribute, the static instance variable, the static variable can be created by simply putting the keyword static, and what that's going to do then is it's going to be shared among all objects. So down here, let's go under our toString, and let's say something like ID is equal to ID. And if this is working properly, what we'll get is that the ID should match and be the same for all of our candy bars. No matter what the name and the calories and the weight and the cost, the ID should be the same for all occurrences. So if we run this, notice we say the ID is 1. That's because we've already created 1 here. And notice I'm printing out twice, and the ID, these are 2 different candy bars, right? And the ID is 2. And finally here, ID is 3. If we want to prove this to be true, let's go back into main, and we can display. Right? Let's just do at the end here, system.out.println your candy bar, and we'll do my candy bar, and his candy bar, and her candy bar. Okay? And if we run this, notice that all of the candy bars here, the nothing candy bar, the Three Musketeers, so forth, right? All of the IDs are the same, and that's because it's a static variable. ID is shared among all of them. But how about that unique ID? Let's check that out. Let's modify. Let's go back under here under candybar.java and change this to where it's referring to different, let's have it display its unique ID here before we get to the shared ID. Let's say something to the effect of unique ID is equal to, and then let's print out the unique ID. Okay, so now what we'll get is we'll see the actual unique IDs being displayed in our toString, and we'll still show that shared ID. If we run this then, you can see up here that I create my first candy bar and it's got a unique ID. This is a lot of milliseconds that have passed since 1970, and its unique ID, notice we concatenate the 0 and then the 1. You can see 2, 1, 0, 1, 2. So here we've actually got 3 different candy bars, and the her candy bar, and if you go back up here, the his candy bar and the your candy bar are both pointing to that same nothing bar. That's why they have the same ID here. Okay. The last thing we need to do, notice we haven't really changed main.java except to add a little bit of system.out.println. It's quite nice to be able to update the class candy bar and still have everything in main work quite nicely for us. Now the equals still works. Notice these 2 candy bars are equal. It's still working. These 2 candy bars are not equal. All of that works. We could update our equals to do a comparison on the unique ID. I'm actually recommending that we leave this alone, because clearly every single candy bar that we make is going to have a different unique ID. Every one of these is going to have a different ID, and there would be no way for any 2 candy bars to actually be equal to each other if we did a comparison on the unique ID. So I'm going to leave that part out and still only do a comparison on the equals method on the name and the calories and the weight and the cost. And if the name and the calories and the weight and the cost match, I'm just going to ignore the unique ID. So the Snickers bar is a Snickers bar, even though it was manufactured maybe at a different date or at a different plant such that its unique ID doesn't match. That's okay. We're going to leave that alone and just keep our equals the same. But what we do need to change is our hash code function. Notice that I'm only using the name, calories, weight, and cost in my hash code. So I'm not making use of the unique ID. So let's highlight the hash code function and delete it. And then under source, let's recreate the hash function. So click on source, insert code, hash code, and select that unique ID string. Okay, and now it's going to make use of that string, and our hash code is going to be a bit better in that regard. Now again, hash code is a little bit advanced for right now in the course, so if this is a bit confusing to you, no worries, don't worry about that at all. We'll get back to it when we talk about hash tables and data structures at the end of the course. So to review, what you should have gotten out of this tutorial is that we can create shared static variables, and this just by using the keyword static in the definition, and this static variable is going to be shared among all occurrences or all objects of this class. We can set a instance variable, such as this unique ID, based on the ID or the shared static, like we're doing here inside of this set unique ID function. And we can also mark methods as static. So in this case, the update ID method is marked static, and the key there is that we can only use static variables within a static method. Watch what would happen if I tried to do something like name is equal to Bob. All right? This is going to give us an error because name is a non-static variable, and we can't use a non-static variable or an instance variable inside of a static method. Okay? And that'll do it for this tutorial.